The flight that changed everything. Dr. Alicia Monroe sat quietly in her seat, staring out the window as the plane began to move. The lights of the city below flickered like distant memories. For a moment, she allowed herself to drift, taking in the sensation of being on a flight without the weight of responsibility pressing against her every thought. It had been years since she had a moment to herself, and this flight was supposed to be a breath of fresh air. She adjusted the collar of her navy blue blazer, her fingers instinctively brushing against the edges of the old leather-bound medical journal she always carried. Alicia was one of the brightest minds in her field, a renowned cardiologist at one of the top hospitals in the country. Her achievements had set her apart, but the road to success had never been easy. Growing up in a small town in Mississippi, she had always been the underdog, fighting to prove herself every step of the way. Despite the many accolades, deep down, Alicia still carried the insecurities of that small-town girl who never felt she fully belonged. She exhaled softly, closing her eyes as the plane began to ascend. This trip wasn't just about getting away from work. It was a chance for her to reconnect with herself. She was headed to a medical conference in Los Angeles, a break she hadn't wanted but desperately needed. Her colleagues had practically forced her to take the trip, insisting that even she needed to recharge. She had always been the first to show up at work, the last to leave, and the one to stay calm when everyone else lost their composure. As the plane leveled out, Alicia let her thoughts wander to the patients she had left behind. There was Mr. Reynolds, a 55-year-old man recovering from open-heart surgery, and young Olivia, a 6-year-old battling a rare heart defect. The weight of her responsibility to them was always there, like an invisible tether pulling her back to the hospital. Just as Alicia was beginning to relax, she noticed a man in the row ahead of her struggling to push an oversized bag into the overhead compartment. He was tall, with thinning hair and a sharp jawline that might have been handsome had it not been twisted in frustration. Dressed in an expensive but slightly wrinkled suit, he looked like the kind of person used to having things his way. "Excuse me, sir, your bag is too large to fit," a flight attendant said, her voice polite but firm. The man grunted in annoyance, jamming the bag harder into the compartment. "I fly first class all the time. This has never been an issue before," he muttered, his voice rising in frustration. Alicia, watching the scene unfold, felt the familiar tug of compassion. She leaned forward slightly. "Would you like some help?" she asked, her voice calm and kind, a reflex she had developed from years of dealing with agitated patients and their families. The man shot her a look, his eyes narrowing. "No," he snapped. "I've got it." The flight attendant tried once more, her professional demeanor unshaken. "Sir, I'm afraid I'll have to take the bag and store it for you. It's a safety requirement." With a huff, the man finally relented, handing over the bag and dropping into his seat with an exaggerated sigh. Alicia turned back to her window, deciding not to let the man's rudeness get to her. She had encountered people like him many times before, men who couldn't quite believe someone like her could be in first class, dressed as sharply as she was, a successful doctor. It was the same look she had gotten from professors, colleagues, and sometimes even patients when they first saw her. As the flight continued, Alicia tried to focus on her plans for the conference. She had been invited to give a keynote address, a huge honor in the medical world, and she wanted to deliver something meaningful, something that reflected not just her professional journey, but the personal battles she had fought along the way. She was lost in thought when the man next to her cleared his throat loudly. "First class, huh?" His voice was laced with sarcasm. He glanced sideways at her, sizing her up with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Alicia turned her head slowly to meet his gaze. She had long grown used to this kind of subtle scrutiny, the unspoken disbelief that someone like her, a black woman, could occupy the space she did. "Yes," she replied evenly. "First class." The man raised an eyebrow. "What do you do?" Alicia didn't hesitate. "I'm a cardiologist." The man blinked, as though trying to reconcile her response with whatever preconception he had built up in his mind. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "A cardiologist. You must be pretty good at what you do to afford this seat." "I'd like to think so," Alicia replied, her tone steady, though inside she could feel the familiar tension beginning to rise. She had nothing to prove to this man, but the years of subtle, and sometimes overt, discrimination had conditioned her to always be prepared for these kinds of interactions. He shifted in his seat, clearly not satisfied with her calm response. "It's just, you don't look the type." Alicia kept her gaze steady. The type. She could feel the weight of the conversation shifting. A confrontation she had hoped to avoid, but one she had encountered too many times to let slide now. "You know, the type to be in first class, flying around to fancy conferences," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Alicia's jaw tightened. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let this man's narrow view of the world diminish her. "And what exactly is that type?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, daring him to answer. The man hesitated, clearly not expecting her to challenge him. He muttered something under his breath and turned away, staring out the window as if the conversation had ended. But Alicia knew the feeling all too well, the subtle racism that lingered in his words, the kind that wasn't loud or violent but was just as damaging. She took a deep breath, her mind replaying the countless times she had faced this kind of scrutiny. From her days in medical school to her residency, she had always been the different one, the one who didn't quite fit the mold. But she had never let it stop her, and she wasn't about to start now. As the flight attendants began to serve dinner, Alicia turned her attention to the menu, deciding to let the moment pass. But the encounter stayed with her, a reminder that no matter how far she had come, there were always battles left to fight. The flight continued smoothly, the hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop to her thoughts. But Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't done. She glanced at him briefly, noticing the tension still radiating from his rigid posture. Something told her that this encounter was far from over. A crisis in the sky. The hum of the airplane's engines was like a lullaby, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of white noise. Dr. Alicia Monroe tried to refocus on her conference notes, but her mind kept drifting back to the man sitting beside her. She could feel the tension radiating off him, even though neither had spoken since their terse exchange. He was restless, shifting in his seat, tapping his fingers on the armrest, clearly unsettled. Alicia could sense that this wasn't just about a bad day or an oversized carry-on. She leaned back in her seat, deciding to ignore him. The last thing she wanted was to ruin the one chance she had to relax before her demanding schedule resumed. But something about his demeanor kept nagging at her, a gnawing sensation at the back of her mind. Years in the medical field had honed her instincts, and they were telling her that this man's irritation went beyond mere frustration. Just as she was beginning to convince herself to let it go, she heard it, a faint groan coming from the seat ahead of them. At first, she dismissed it as someone adjusting in their seat, but then it came again, louder this time. Alicia's ears perked up, her senses sharpening. She recognized that sound, a low moan of discomfort, almost like someone in pain. A flight attendant had just passed by, her cart filled with drinks and snacks, but the sound caused Alicia to glance down the aisle. There it was again, a weak, gasping noise. Alicia's pulse quickened. It was the kind of noise that signaled trouble, the kind that couldn't be ignored. She unclasped her seatbelt and stood up, looking toward the source of the sound. 2 rows ahead, an elderly woman slumped against the window, her face pale, eyes half closed. The passenger next to her was shaking her shoulder gently, clearly alarmed. Alicia's body moved before her mind caught up. All the weariness she had felt moments earlier evaporated, replaced by the familiar rush of adrenaline that came whenever she stepped into crisis mode. She walked quickly toward the woman, her voice steady but authoritative, as she addressed the passengers nearby. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm a doctor. Let me through." The other passengers looked up, startled but immediately parted to give her space. The elderly woman's breathing was shallow, her skin clammy. Alicia knelt beside her, gently touching her wrist to feel for a pulse. Weak and thready. The woman's eyelids fluttered, but her gaze was unfocused. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Alicia asked, her voice calm but firm. "Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." No response. "Someone get the flight attendant," Alicia called out, her tone urgent but controlled. She had handled dozens of medical emergencies, but the stakes were always higher when the environment was this confined. She quickly assessed the woman's condition. There was no obvious trauma, but her symptoms suggested something far more dangerous, likely a heart attack. The flight attendant rushed over, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "No, this woman is in distress," Alicia said, her voice crisp. "I believe she's having a heart attack. Do you have a medical kit on board?" The flight attendant nodded, her eyes widening. "Yes, we do. I'll get it right away." As the flight attendant hurried off, Alicia continued her assessment, trying to keep the woman stable until she had the tools she needed. Time was critical in situations like this. A heart attack in a hospital was one thing, but up here, thousands of feet in the air, options were limited. Every second counted. Alicia glanced at the passengers nearby, many of whom were now watching anxiously. Her gaze landed on the man from earlier, the one who had questioned her place in first class. His eyes were wide, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and discomfort. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, his voice suddenly softer, the condescending tone gone. Alicia didn't have time for pleasantries, but she appreciated the shift in his demeanor. "Yes. Make sure no one else crowds this area. We need space, and I need it quiet so I can concentrate." The man nodded, surprisingly obedient, and stood up to move people back. Alicia turned her focus back to the woman, whose breathing had become more labored. She needed the medical kit. Now. Moments later, the flight attendant returned with a small hard case. Alicia quickly opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Basic tools, but no defibrillator. Her heart sank slightly, but she stayed focused. She found what she needed: aspirin, an oxygen mask, and nitroglycerin. She slipped the oxygen mask over the woman's face and opened her mouth just enough to slip the nitroglycerin under her tongue. "Just hold on," Alicia whispered, her voice more to herself than to the woman. She felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on her, the knowledge that this woman's life was literally in her hands. The passengers watched in silence as Alicia worked, the gravity of the situation settling over the cabin like a heavy fog. She felt the pulse again, still weak, but steady. Good. They were making progress, but this was only the beginning. The woman needed more advanced care, and fast. "How far are we from our destination?" Alicia asked the flight attendant, keeping her focus on the patient. "We're about 2 hours away," the attendant replied, her voice shaky. Alicia's mind raced. 2 hours was a long time to wait, especially when dealing with something as unpredictable as a heart attack. The nitroglycerin would help, but it wasn't a cure. This woman needed a hospital. "We need to land as soon as possible," Alicia said. "Is there a closer airport?" "I'll check with the captain," the attendant said, already moving toward the cockpit. Alicia stayed with the woman, monitoring her vital signs as best she could without the proper equipment. The woman's breathing seemed to ease slightly, but her color was still concerningly pale. Alicia knew that every minute they stayed in the air increased the risk of complications. She glanced up again at the man, who was still standing nearby, watching her work. His earlier arrogance had melted away, replaced by something like awe, or perhaps shame. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alicia didn't answer right away. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep, especially in situations like this. "We're doing everything we can," she said finally, her tone measured. "But she needs a hospital. The sooner we land, the better her chances." The man nodded, his eyes not leaving the woman. It was as if he was seeing Alicia for the first time. not as an outsider in his world, but as the skilled professional she was. He opened his mouth to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent. Minutes later, the flight attendant returned, her face pale. "The captain is coordinating with air traffic control. We're going to divert to the nearest airport." Alicia nodded, her focus never wavering from her patient. The plane would be descending soon, and Alicia needed to keep the woman stable during the approach. She checked the woman's pulse again. It was still weak, but at least it hadn't disappeared. As the flight began to shift and the plane prepared for its descent, Alicia remained by the woman's side, her hand steady and her mind focused. The cabin crew informed the passengers of the emergency landing, and there were murmurs of concern throughout the plane. But Alicia was locked in. The only thing that mattered was keeping this woman alive until they reached the ground. As the plane began its descent, Alicia felt the familiar pressure in her ears and watched the woman closely for any signs of distress. The pulse remained steady. For now, they were in the clear, but Alicia knew better than to relax too soon. The man from earlier had taken his seat but kept glancing toward her, as if he were waiting for permission to speak. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I didn't expect. I didn't realize." He trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Alicia looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm that she had earned through years of experience. "It's okay," she said simply, but her tone carried the weight of their earlier conversation. She didn't need to say more. The man nodded, understanding the gravity of both the moment and the lesson he was learning. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, Alicia felt a wave of relief wash over her. They were on the ground. Paramedics would be waiting, and this woman would get the care she needed. But as the plane taxied toward the gate, Alicia knew that the real battle wasn't over. For every life she saved, there were always more to fight for, both in the hospital and in the world outside. Unspoken transformations. As the plane touched down with a soft thud, Dr. Alicia Monroe let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The elderly woman beside her was still breathing, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. But Alicia knew they weren't out of the woods yet. This woman needed a hospital, proper tests, and continuous monitoring. Things she simply couldn't provide at 30,000 feet. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone calm but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical emergency, we have made an unscheduled landing at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. We ask that everyone remain seated while paramedics board the plane to assist the passenger in need." The collective murmur of the passengers quieted as the gravity of the situation sank in. Alicia remained seated beside the elderly woman, gently holding her wrist, counting her pulse as the paramedics rushed on board. The elderly woman's breathing was still shallow, but she was conscious now, her eyes half open, staring blankly at the ceiling. "You did well," Alicia whispered to her softly, squeezing her hand gently. "Just hold on a little longer." The paramedics appeared at the front of the plane, their faces set in the focused expression of professionals ready to handle whatever was thrown their way. Alicia briefed them quickly as they assessed the woman. She knew they'd take it from here, but even so, she felt the familiar knot of concern tighten in her stomach. Every doctor knew the haunting feeling of walking away from a patient, unsure if they would ever see them again. As the paramedics prepared to move the woman onto a stretcher, Alicia stood up, stepping back to give them space. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, but she was used to it. After years of being the only black woman in a room full of mostly white colleagues, she had learned to carry herself with quiet confidence, regardless of who was watching. The man from earlier, David, as she had learned when he briefly introduced himself during the chaotic moments of the emergency, was still seated nearby, watching her with an intensity she hadn't expected. His expression had shifted from the smug arrogance he had worn earlier to something more complicated, something almost like remorse. The elderly woman was carefully loaded onto the stretcher, and as the paramedics wheeled her down the narrow aisle toward the exit, Alicia caught the woman's eye. For a brief moment, The woman smiled faintly, her lips barely curling but enough for Alicia to recognize it as a gesture of gratitude. It was a small moment, but it meant everything to Alicia. It was the reason she had chosen medicine in the first place, to help people in their most vulnerable moments. As the paramedics left, the tension in the cabin seemed to lift slightly. Conversation started up again, albeit in hushed tones, as the passengers began to absorb what had just happened. But Alicia wasn't thinking about them. Her mind was still on the woman, wondering if she'd make it to the hospital in time. The flight attendant approached her cautiously. "Dr. Monroe, thank you for what you did. We'll be able to continue our flight in about 30 minutes once the plane is refueled." Alicia nodded, feeling the exhaustion beginning to settle into her bones. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, and all she wanted now was to sit down and gather herself. But before she could, she felt a presence beside her. "Dr. Monroe." It was David, standing awkwardly, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked uncomfortable, like someone who wasn't used to apologizing, but knew he had to. Alicia turned to face him, surprised at the shift in his demeanor. "Yes, I just wanted to say thank you." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "And I'm sorry for earlier. I shouldn't have said what I did." Alicia studied him for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. She had heard apologies like this before, half-hearted, given more out of obligation than sincerity. But there was something in David's eyes that told her this was different. This wasn't just an apology, it was a realization. "I appreciate that," she said finally, her tone measured but kind. She could tell that this was difficult for him, and she didn't want to make it harder than it already was. David shifted on his feet, clearly unsure of how to continue. "You know, I've flown a lot, been around a lot of people. But today, watching you, I realized something. I realized how quick I am to judge people, to make assumptions." Alicia nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I didn't mean to be rude earlier, but I was," he admitted, his voice dropping slightly. "And I know that's on me. I guess I've been so used to seeing the world a certain way, thinking certain things about people before I even get to know them. But you?" He paused, searching for the right words. "You showed me today that I was wrong." Alicia raised an eyebrow, surprised by his candor. She had met plenty of people like David before, successful, privileged men whom never had to question their place in the world. But rarely did they admit their flaws so openly. "We all make mistakes," Alicia said, her voice softening. "The important thing is that we learn from them." David nodded, his face relaxing slightly, as if her words had given him permission to let go of some of the guilt he had been carrying. I don't know what I would have done if that had been me sitting there, watching someone die, unable to do anything. But you." He gestured toward the aisle where the paramedics had taken the elderly woman. "You didn't hesitate. You stepped up. That's something I could never do." Alicia smiled, but there was a heaviness to it. "It's not about being able to do something or not. It's about doing what you can when the moment comes." She paused, her eyes locking with his. "But I'm glad you realize that what we think about people, who we assume they are, doesn't define their worth or capability." David looked down, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I'm beginning to see that." There was a brief silence between them, not awkward but contemplative. Alicia could sense that David was processing more than just what had happened on the flight. He was confronting something deeper, something that had probably been festering for a long time, but had finally been dragged into the light by this unexpected turn of events. "Listen," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "I know I don't deserve any favors, but I'd like to make it right. Maybe I can help in some way. Donate to a cause you support or something like that. It's the least I can do." Alicia appreciated the gesture, but she wasn't looking for charity. She had spent her entire career earning her place, not accepting handouts. Still, she knew that for David, this was about more than just giving money. It was his way of trying to correct the assumptions he had made, to prove, to both her and himself, that he was more than the man she had encountered earlier. "You don't need to do that," Alicia said gently. "But if you want to help, there are always ways. Volunteering, raising awareness, mentoring. The world doesn't need more empty gestures. It needs people willing to make a real change." David looked at her thoughtfully, nodding slowly. "I think I'd like to do that," he said quietly. "Make a real change." Alicia gave him a small, understanding smile. She could tell that David was sincere, and while she didn't expect him to become a completely different person overnight, she knew that this moment had shifted something in him. Maybe it was just a seed, but sometimes that was all it took. As the flight crew announced that they were preparing to take off again, David returned to his seat, but the air between them had changed. The tension that had been so palpable earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, more respectful. Alicia sat back down, her mind still racing, but her heart lighter than it had been before. She had faced many challenges in her life, far more difficult than an uncomfortable conversation on an airplane. But something about today felt different. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about showing someone the power of seeing beyond their preconceived notions. As the plane lifted off into the sky once again, Alicia looked out the window at the clouds rolling by. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to relax, knowing that she had made a difference, not just for the woman whose life she had saved, but for the man who had seen her for who she really was. Reflections of resilience. The flight continued smoothly after the emergency landing, but for Dr. Alicia Monroe, the quiet hum of the engines couldn't drown out the thoughts racing through her mind. As she looked out the window, watching the dark clouds swirl beneath them, she couldn't help but reflect on the many battles she had fought to get to where she was. Saving a life, proving herself, and even moments like the one with David were all part of her journey. Yet these moments never seemed to lose their weight, no matter how often they happened. As the plane ascended once again into the sky, Alicia's mind drifted back to her early days, long before she became a renowned cardiologist, before her name was listed among the best in her field. She could still remember the first time she walked into her medical school orientation. The large, intimidating lecture hall had been filled with fresh faces, bright and eager, all buzzing with the excitement of starting their medical careers. But Alicia had been all too aware of how few of those faces looked like hers. It wasn't the first time she had been in a space where she was different, but it was one of the most profound. Out of a class of over 100 students, only a handful were black, and even fewer were black women. She could still feel the cold stares, the sideways glances, and the subtle questions that lingered in people's eyes. Does she really belong here? Alicia smiled bitterly at the memory. The unspoken doubts had followed her throughout her career, like shadows cast long by the setting sun. In every room she entered, there was always that one moment when she had to prove herself, not just as a doctor, but as a woman of color in a profession dominated by white men. It was exhausting, but she had long since made peace with the fact that she would always have to work twice as hard to earn half as much respect. She shifted slightly in her seat, the weight of those memories pressing against her chest. It wasn't that she resented the hard work. She had always been willing to put in the hours, to give her all. But sometimes, the constant need to prove her worth felt like an invisible burden, one she could never fully set down. Alicia glanced over at David, who was staring out his window, lost in his own thoughts. His earlier apology had been sincere, but it also reminded her of how common these moments were. People like David didn't realize the weight of their assumptions until something forced them to confront it. For David, it had taken watching Alicia save a life to make him see beyond the surface, to challenge his preconceived notions of what success and competence looked like. But for Alicia, this was her everyday reality. She had worked tirelessly to carve out her place in the medical world, not just for herself, but for every young black girl who might one day walk in her footsteps. She had long since accepted that her success wasn't just hers. It belonged to the countless women of color who had been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside. Alicia carried their hopes and their struggles with her every time she donned her white coat. As the plane cruised through the clouds, Alicia thought back to her time in medical school. She had been determined to make it, despite the many obstacles thrown her way. The microaggressions had come in many forms: classmates who questioned her abilities, professors who assumed she wasn't as capable, and patients who sometimes refused to believe she was their doctor. One particularly vivid memory stood out to her. It had been her third year of medical school, the year when students began their clinical rotations. Alicia had been assigned to the cardiology department, her first taste of what would eventually become her specialty. She had walked into the room of an older male patient, his face drawn with pain as he lay in the hospital bed, wires and monitors surrounding him. "Good morning, Mr. Hastings," Alicia had said brightly, pulling his chart from the end of the bed. "I'm Dr. Monroe, and I'll be assisting with your care today." Mr. Hastings had looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Doctor?" he had asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "You're too young to be a doctor. Where's the real one?" Alicia had kept her smile, but inside, she felt the familiar sting of doubt. She had explained her role, reassured him of her qualifications, but no matter how much she said, the patient's doubt lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. It had taken weeks for Mr. Hastings to come around, to see that Alicia wasn't just the young black girl in a white coat, but a skilled and competent doctor. But that was the reality she faced every day, having to prove her worth again and again, sometimes to people who refused to see her as anything more than the color of her skin. She had grown used to it, but that didn't mean it was any easier. Alicia sighed softly, the memories of those early days mixing with her current reality. She was no longer that uncertain medical student trying to navigate a world that seemed designed to exclude her. She was Dr. Alicia Monroe, a leading cardiologist with a reputation for excellence. But even now, years later, the subtle biases remained, like an ever-present hum in the background of her life. As if on cue, David spoke up, pulling Alicia from her thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice tentative. Alicia turned to face him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "Sure," she said, keeping her voice neutral. How do you deal with it?" he asked, his eyes flicking to hers, then away again. "The constant judgment. You must know what I mean, right? I've never had to think about it before." Alicia regarded him for a moment, studying his face. There was no malice in his question, no hidden agenda. He was genuinely trying to understand something that had been invisible to him for most of his life. "It's not easy," she admitted, leaning back in her seat. "But I don't really have a choice. If I let every sideways glance or doubting comment get to me, I wouldn't be where I am today." David nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "But doesn't it get exhausting?" Alicia smiled faintly. "Every day. But the thing is, when you've lived with it your whole life, you learn to push past it. You learn to focus on the work, on what really matters. At the end of the day, I'm not here to prove myself to people like you. I'm here to save lives. That's what keeps me going." David looked down at his hands, his face contemplative. "I never thought about it like that." "Most people don't," Alicia said gently. "It's easy not to think about something when it doesn't affect you directly." He nodded again, more to himself than to her. Alicia could see the wheels turning in his mind, the slow realization of how much privilege had shaped his worldview. It wasn't that David was a bad person, far from it. But like many people in his position, he had been blind to the struggles of those who didn't share his background, his skin color, or his gender. For the first time, Alicia saw in David something she hadn't seen before, the potential for real change. "You know," she said after a moment, "it's not about being perfect or never making mistakes. It's about being willing to learn, to admit when you've been wrong. That's where the real change happens." David looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I want to be better," he said quietly, almost as if he were confessing something to himself. "I'd spent so much time thinking I had all the answers, that I knew everything there was to know about people. But watching you today, I realized how little I really know." Alicia smiled, not unkindly. That's the first step. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Alicia glanced back out the window, her thoughts still tangled in the past. But now, there was a sense of peace settling over her. She had faced her fair share of challenges, but in that moment, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Not just because she had saved a life today, but because she had helped someone else see the world a little more clearly. As the plane continued its journey, Alicia allowed herself to relax, finally letting go of the tension that had gripped her earlier. She had come a long way from that uncertain girl in medical school, and while the battles were far from over, she knew that each one had made her stronger. And in the end, that strength was what truly defined her. Echoes of change. As Dr. Alicia Monroe stepped off the plane and into the busy terminal, the cool air of the airport greeted her like a refreshing wave. The ordeal on the flight still clung to her, not just in the physical fatigue from the medical emergency, but in the emotional weight of the conversations that followed. Saving the elderly woman's life had been second nature for her. But what lingered longer than the medical drama was her exchange with David. For once, someone who had judged her too quickly was willing to unlearn and re-examine those judgments. She paused at the gate, scanning the sea of faces rushing past her. The airport buzzed with activity. Families reuniting, business travelers rushing to their next destination, and the constant announcement of arrivals and departures over the loudspeakers. Alicia shifted her carry-on bag onto her shoulder and allowed herself a moment to breathe. The conference she had come to attend now seemed like a distant priority. Her thoughts kept circling back to that flight and how, in just a few hours, her life had collided with a man who represented the kind of quiet, everyday bias that followed her wherever she went. It was the kind of bias that, while not overt, slowly chipped away at the soul, those sideways glances, questioning stares, and assumptions about her worth. But David's shift had been real, and while Alicia had long since stopped waiting for people to change their minds about her, she had seen something in him that surprised her, a genuine willingness to learn, to grow. And that, more than anything, gave her a rare sense of hope. She took a deep breath and headed toward the baggage claim, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors of the airport. The weight of her carry-on bag was nothing compared to the invisible load she had carried her entire career, but for once, she allowed herself to let go of some of it. Maybe, just maybe, moments like these, where people like David began to see the world in a different way, were signs of something bigger. A shift in how people viewed others, not through the lens of race or gender, but through the lens of humanity. By the time she reached the taxi stand, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cityscape. Alicia slid into the backseat of a cab, giving the driver the address of her hotel. The familiar sounds of traffic and city life enveloped her as the car pulled away from the curb. She leaned back against the seat, feeling the tension slowly ease from her shoulders. Tomorrow would be the start of the conference, where she would deliver her keynote address. But tonight, she was giving herself permission to simply exist. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down to see a message from an unfamiliar number. Frowning slightly, she unlocked the phone and opened the text. "Dr. Monroe, this is David from the flight. I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I just wanted to thank you again, not just for saving that woman's life, but for the conversation we had. I've been doing a lot of thinking since we landed, and I realize how blind I've been to things I never even questioned before. I know this probably isn't the time or place, but if you ever have a moment, I'd love to learn more about how I can help, how I can be part of the change. Thank you again, for everything." Alicia stared at the message, a mixture of surprise and gratitude rising within her. She had expected their conversation to end on the plane, like so many encounters in her life. Fleeting moments of confrontation or connection that dissolved as quickly as they began. But this felt different. David wasn't just apologizing. He was seeking to understand, to grow. Her fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to respond now or wait. She wasn't one to hand out easy answers, and she didn't want to let this moment become another instance where someone sought her out to assuage their guilt without committing to real change. But something told her that David was serious. He wasn't just asking to feel better about himself. He genuinely wanted to know what he could do. With a quiet sigh, she typed a brief reply. David, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your words. Change isn't easy, and it's not always comfortable, but it starts with the willingness to listen and learn. If you're serious about wanting to make a difference, there are many ways to get involved. Start by educating yourself, read, listen, and engage with voices that challenge your worldview. And don't be afraid to have the uncomfortable conversations. That's where growth happens. She hesitated for a moment before hitting send. Alicia knew that transformation, especially when it came to deeply ingrained biases, wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, a long, often painful one. But she had seen it before, and she knew that for some, it was possible. She could only hope that David's willingness to learn would lead him down a path of meaningful change. As the taxi wound through the city streets, Alicia's mind drifted back to her own journey. How much she had fought to be where she was. How often she had questioned whether the world would ever see her for who she truly was, and not just through the lens of race or gender. She thought about the countless young black women who would come after her, walking the same path, facing the same biases, and wondered if the world would be any kinder to them. She thought of her mother, strong, unwavering, and always there to remind her of her worth. It had been her mother who had instilled in her the belief that no matter what the world thought of her, her value wasn't tied to anyone else's opinion. It had been her mother who had pushed her to apply to medical school when Alicia wasn't sure she would ever make it. And it had been her mother's quiet strength that had carried her through the darkest days of her career, when the pressure of proving herself felt like too much to bear. Alicia smiled to herself, remembering the late-night phone calls to her mother during those grueling years of residency. Her mother had always known just what to say, never letting Alicia wallow in self-doubt for too long. "They can't take away what's yours," she'd say, her voice steady and sure. "You earned your place, and you'll keep earning it every single day." And she had. Alicia had earned her place, not just in her profession, but in a world that often tried to tell her she didn't belong. She had shattered barriers, not just for herself, but for the women who would follow in her footsteps. And she had done it all with grace, determination, and the quiet fire that her mother had passed down to her. As the taxi pulled up in front of the hotel, Alicia stepped out, feeling the cool evening air brush against her skin. The city lights sparkled in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, Alicia felt a deep sense of peace. She had come a long way, and while the road ahead was still filled with challenges, she knew she was strong enough to face them. Inside the hotel, Alicia checked in, her thoughts already shifting to the next day. Her keynote address would be one of the most important speeches of her career. She had spent weeks preparing, crafting every word carefully. But now, in light of everything that had happened on the flight, she felt a shift in her approach. That night, as she sat at the desk in her hotel room, Alicia pulled out her notes for the speech. She read over them, her pen hovering over the paper, but something didn't feel right. The words, while polished and professional, felt distant, like they didn't quite capture the heart of what she wanted to say. She thought back to the flight, to the elderly woman whose life she had saved, to David's apology, and to the countless patients she had treated over the years. What did it all mean? What was the message she wanted to leave with her audience? And then it hit her. Her speech wasn't just about medicine, or about her journey as a cardiologist. It was about resilience. It was about standing tall in the face of doubt, about fighting for your place in a world that constantly tried to push you out. It was about the quiet strength of women like her mother, who had paved the way for her without ever asking for recognition. Alicia smiled to herself and began to rewrite her speech, her pen moving quickly across the page. The words flowed easily now, straight from her heart. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of her peers and speak not just as a doctor, but as a woman who had faced the weight of the world's expectations and had risen above them. She would speak for the women who came before her, and the women who would come after. The power of the moment. The morning of the conference dawned quietly, a soft light filtering through the curtains of Dr. Alicia Monroe's hotel room. As she stood by the window, looking out at the city below, a sense of calm settled over her. This wasn't the kind of nervousness she had once felt in her early career when stepping into a room full of esteemed colleagues had been a source of anxiety. No, this was something different. An anticipation, a knowing that today something significant was about to happen. Alicia sipped her coffee, her mind briefly flickering to the events of the previous day. The emergency on the plane, her unexpected connection with David, and the conversations that had lingered long after she had landed. It was as if life had handed her a moment, a convergence of experiences that reminded her of the real reasons behind everything she had worked for. Today, she would deliver her keynote speech, not as just another doctor at a prestigious medical conference, but as a woman who had earned every step of her journey, as a woman who had faced countless obstacles, who had been questioned and underestimated at every turn, but had still risen to the top of her field, and as a woman who knew that her presence in that room today was a testament not just to her own resilience, but to the resilience of all those who had come before her. The weight of that legacy settled on her shoulders, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt empowering. Alicia took a deep breath and turned away from the window, her thoughts clear. It was time to get ready. The auditorium buzzed with quiet conversation as attendees filed in, finding their seats and settling in for the day's presentations. It was a diverse crowd. Physicians, surgeons, researchers, and medical students, each eager to hear from the top minds in the field. And among them, Dr. Alicia Monroe stood out, not just because of her reputation as a world-class cardiologist, but because she was known for something more: her voice. When Alicia spoke, people listened, not just because of her expertise, but because of the honesty with which she shared her experiences. She didn't just talk about medical breakthroughs or complex procedures. She spoke about what it meant to be a doctor, to navigate a world where personal identity was often weighed as heavily as professional competence. Today, she would speak to that, and more. As Alicia made her way backstage, the conference coordinator greeted her with a warm smile. "Dr. Monroe, we're ready for you. You're up in 5 minutes." Alicia nodded, her face calm, though her mind was fully alert. She had given hundreds of speeches over the years, but this one felt different. It was more personal, more reflective of the woman she had become rather than just the doctor she had trained to be. The minutes ticked down, and soon she was being introduced to the audience, her name echoing across the vast room. Alicia could hear the applause ripple through the crowd, but it wasn't the sound of their approval that fueled her. It was the knowledge that today she would speak her truth. As she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights temporarily blinding her, Alicia took a deep breath and walked confidently to the podium. The audience quieted, their eyes fixed on her, waiting. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I want to start by telling you a story." A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Alicia hadn't planned to open her speech with a story, but after everything that had happened on the plane, she knew this was the right way to begin. "Yesterday, on my flight here, something happened that reminded me of why I became a doctor in the first place." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. An elderly woman had a heart attack mid-flight. In that moment, nothing mattered except her survival. The tools at my disposal were limited, the environment wasn't ideal, and yet, we made it through. She survived because of quick thinking, training, and a bit of luck. But what struck me the most wasn't just the medical emergency itself. It was the reaction of the people around me. Alicia glanced briefly at the back of the room, where she knew David was seated. He had messaged her that morning, telling her he would be attending the conference to hear her speak. She didn't know why, but she appreciated that he had come. There was a man on that flight, someone who judged me before I even had a chance to speak. Someone who looked at me and saw not a doctor, not a professional, but something else. Something less. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, feeling the tension rise as the audience absorbed her meaning. And yet, in the moment of crisis, all of those judgments faded away. It didn't matter what he thought of me. It only mattered that I could help. And I did. Alicia paused, her voice softening slightly. The reason I share this story isn't to point fingers at that man, or to say that his reaction was unusual. In fact, it's the opposite. His reaction was all too common. But what mattered most was what happened after. In the aftermath of that emergency, he came to me, not just with an apology, but with a desire to learn, to change. She saw a few heads nodding in the crowd, people connecting the dots, understanding the broader significance of what she was saying. You see, as medical professionals, we are trained to diagnose, to treat, and to heal. But sometimes, the healing that needs to happen isn't just physical. It's deeper. It's societal. It's the unspoken judgments, the biases we carry, often without even realizing it. And that healing requires something more than just skill. It requires understanding. It requires humility. And it requires us to look beyond our preconceived notions and see the human being standing before us. Alicia let those words sink in before continuing. I had spent my career navigating a world that wasn't always designed for someone like me. I faced the doubts, the skepticism, the questioning of whether I belong in this space. But through it all, I've learned something important. Your worth isn't determined by the opinions of others. Your worth is determined by your actions, by the lives you touch, and by the change you inspire in the people around you. She glanced down at her notes, but she didn't need them. The words were coming from a place of truth, a place she had carried with her all these years. We talk a lot about excellence in our field, about the pursuit of knowledge and the advancement of medicine. But today, I want to challenge you to think about something more. I want to challenge you to think about how we treat each other, about how we see each other. Because no matter how skilled we are, no matter how many lives we save, if we fail to see the humanity in those around us, whether it's our patients or our colleagues, then we've failed in the most fundamental way. The room was silent now, the kind of silence that comes when people are truly listening. Alicia could feel the energy shift as her words reached them, not just as professionals, but as people. Excellence in medicine is not just about technical skill. It's about compassion. It's about empathy. It's about standing up for those who are marginalized, for those whose voices are too often silenced. And it's about recognizing that our strength lies not just in what we know, but in how we use that knowledge to uplift others. Alicia paused again, her gaze moving over the faces in the crowd. So I ask you, what kind of doctor do you want to be? What kind of person do you want to be? Will you be the one who stands on the sidelines, content with the status quo? Or will you be the one who challenges it, who fights for change, who sees the humanity in every person, regardless of their background, their race, their gender? The room remained silent, but Alicia could feel the impact of her words. She had given countless speeches over the years, but this one felt different. This one wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. It was about the future of the field she loved and the people within it. She took a deep breath, her voice soft but resolute as she concluded. We are healers, and that means healing not just the body, but the mind, the soul, and the world around us. So I challenge you, be the kind of doctor, the kind of person who makes that healing possible for everyone. Alicia stepped back from the podium, and for a moment there was silence. Then the room erupted into applause, a wave of sound that filled the auditorium. Alicia smiled, not at the applause itself, but at what it represented, a recognition that the conversation she had started was one that needed to be had, and one that wouldn't end when she left the stage. In the audience, David sat quietly, watching as Alicia stepped off the stage. Her words had hit him hard, not just because of their power, but because they had spoken directly to the journey he had started the day before. He had come to the conference expecting to hear a speech about medicine, but what he had received was something far more profound, a call to action. As the applause continued to swell, David stood up, joining the crowd in their recognition of Alicia's message. But for him, this wasn't just about applause. It was about the commitment he had made to himself and to the woman who had challenged him to see the world in a new way. He knew now that his journey was just beginning. Later that evening, Alicia sat in her hotel room, reflecting on the day's events. The conference had gone better than she could have hoped, but what mattered most to her was the quiet conversation she had after her speech. Several attendees had approached her, sharing their own experiences of bias and inequality in the medical field. Others had simply thanked her for speaking the truth that too often went unspoken. Among them had been David. Their conversation had been brief, but meaningful. He had thanked her again, not just for the words she had shared, but for opening his eyes to something he had never fully understood. He had told her that he was committed to learning, to doing better, and Alicia had believed him. As she sat there, the city lights twinkling outside her window, Alicia felt a quiet satisfaction. She had come to the conference expecting to give a speech, but what she had given and received was something far more important. She had started a conversation, one that she hoped would continue long after the applause had faded. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She had made her mark, not just in medicine, but in the hearts and minds of those who were willing to listen, to learn, and to change. And that, she knew, was the most important work of all.